Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy parlours and candlelit bedrooms of Victorian England, where the rustle of silk and the whisper of scandal hide a truth most history books won't tell you. Sex wasn't just awkward for Victorian women, it was absolutely terrifying. And before you think this is just another tale of prudish corsets and fainting couches, let me tell you something that'll make your skin crawl. If you were a woman in Victorian England, your wedding night wasn't a celebration. It was a medical emergency waiting to happen. And that's just the beginning. So before we dive into this rabbit hole of Victorian horror, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we're exploring together. And tell me, what city are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? I love knowing where this journey is taking us. Now dim the lights. Maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's step back into a world where desire was dangerous and ignorance could literally kill you. You wake up on a foggy London morning in 1855, the air tastes of coal smoke and uncertainty. You're 17 years old, which makes you practically an old maid by Victorian standards, and today is your wedding day. You should be excited, right? Wrong, because everything you know about what's going to happen tonight could fit on the head of a pin, and most of it is probably wrong anyway. Welcome to Victorian England, where sex education consisted of your mother whispering something vague about wifely duties while avoiding eye contact, and your new husband learned everything he knows from medical textbooks that describe women's bodies like broken machinery. This isn't going to end well. Here's what nobody tells you about Victorian sexuality. The era we think of as the height of moral prudishness was actually obsessed with sex. Completely, utterly, dangerously obsessed. They just wrapped that obsession in so many layers of shame, medical nonsense, and social control that it became toxic. For women especially, sex wasn't just private. It was pathologized, criminalized, and turned into a weapon against their own bodies. Let me paint you a picture of what Victorian women were actually dealing with. First, there's the medical establishment, run entirely by men who had never experienced menstruation, pregnancy, or childbirth, but were absolutely convinced they understood women's bodies better than women did. These doctors believed that women's reproductive organs were basically ticking time bombs of hysteria. Too much education, your uterus would literally wander around your body causing madness. Too much physical activity, your ovaries would shrivel up. And God forbid you actually enjoyed sex, because that was a one-way ticket to nymphomania, which was considered a legitimate mental illness. Then there's the social pressure. Victorian society had turned female purity into a currency more valuable than gold. Your virginity wasn't just your own business. It was your family's reputation, your husband's property, and society's obsession, all rolled into one terrifying package. Lose it to the wrong person, at the wrong time, or heaven forbid, enjoy losing it. And you weren't just ruined. You were erased, cast out, forgotten. But here's where it gets really twisted. While women were being told that any sexual feeling was basically a symptom of mental illness, they were simultaneously expected to be perfect wives and mothers. You had to be pure enough to make the angels weep, but fertile enough to produce heirs, modest enough to never think about sex, but skilled enough to keep your husband satisfied. It was an impossible standard designed to drive women insane, and honestly, it often did. The Victorian era didn't invent sexual shame, but they perfected it. They turned it into an art form, a science, and a religion all at once. And at the centre of this twisted web sat Victorian women, told they were too delicate for education, too fragile for independence, too pure for pleasure, but somehow strong enough to die in childbirth over and over again without complaints. Now you might be thinking, surely it wasn't that bad for everyone. Rich women had it easier, right? Oh, sweet summer child, money might have bought you better doctors, but it also bought you more surveillance. Upper-class Victorian women lived in gilded cages where every glance, every laugh, every friendship was scrutinised for signs of impropriety. They had more to lose, more eyes watching them, and more rules to follow. And poor women? They had different problems, but not easier ones. They might have escaped some of the more ridiculous social restrictions, but they faced dangers that would make your blood run cold. Factory work during pregnancy, back alley medical procedures, and the constant threat of violence from men who knew the law would never protect a working-class woman's word over theirs. But here's what I want you to understand about this era, and why we're spending time in these suffocating parlours and dangerous back streets. The Victorian obsession with controlling women's sexuality wasn't just about sex, it was about power. It was about keeping women dependent, ignorant, and afraid. Because a woman who understood her own body, who knew her own desires, who could make her own choices about pleasure and reproduction, was a woman who might start asking dangerous questions about everything else. The Victorians understood something that we're still grappling with today. Sexual autonomy and political autonomy are connected. A society that controls women's bodies is a society that controls women, period. And Victorian England was very, very good at control. So as we walk through these gaslit streets and peek behind these heavy curtains, remember that we're not just looking at old-fashioned prudishness. We're looking at a systematic campaign to convince half the population that their own bodies were enemies, that their own desires were diseases, and that their only value lay in their ability to suffer in silence. Tonight, we're going to uncover how deep this rabbit hole goes. We'll meet the doctors who diagnosed women with hysteria for reading too much, the husbands who believed their wives' pleasure was literally dangerous to their health, the mothers who passed down trauma disguised as wisdom, and the women who somehow survived it all, often by finding ways to resist that would make your Victorian grandmother blush. But first, let's start with the wedding night. Because if you want to understand why sex was terrifying for Victorian women, you have to understand that for many of them, their first sexual experience was also their first lesson in powerlessness. Picture this. You're that 17-year-old bride we met earlier. You've been dressed in white, paraded down an aisle, and legally transferred from your father's property to your husband's. The ceremony's over, the guests have gone home, and now you're alone with a man who might be a stranger, in a room where you're expected to do something no one has properly explained to you. Your husband, bless his heart, probably knows about as much as you do, which is to say, almost nothing useful. His education came from medical textbooks that described sex as a regrettable necessity for reproduction, friends who shared myths and misinformation, and possibly some experience with prostitutes who were paid to fake enjoyment. He's been told that good women don't enjoy sex, that your resistance is natural and proper, and that it's his job to overcome that resistance for the good of the marriage. You, meanwhile, have been told that what's about to happen will hurt, that you should lie still and think of England, and that your new husband has the legal right to your body, whether you want it or not. Because yes, marital rape wasn't just legal in Victorian England, it was considered impossible. The marriage contract gave your husband permanent consent to your body, and your feelings about it were irrelevant. So there you are, two people who care about each other, trying to figure out one of the most intimate acts humans can share, with no guidance except shame, fear, and a legal system that treats one of you like property. Is it any wonder that so many Victorian marriages were disasters? But the wedding night was just the beginning. Because once you were married, your body wasn't just your husband's property, it was also the subject of intense medical and social scrutiny. Every month, people would be watching for signs of pregnancy. Every illness would be blamed on your reproductive system. Every emotion would be analysed for signs of hysteria or nymphomania. And if you were unlucky enough to actually enjoy sex, well, that's where things got really dangerous. Because the Victorian medical establishment had some very specific ideas about women who experienced sexual pleasure, and none of them were good. The diagnosis of nymphomania was applied to any woman who seemed to want sex too much, enjoy it too openly, or, God forbid, initiate it herself. The treatment options ranged from cold baths and bland diets to clitoridectomies and confinement in asylums. We're not talking about a few extreme cases here. We're talking about a systematic medical campaign to pathologize female desire. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, one of the most respected gynecologists in Victorian England, performed hundreds of clitoridectomies on women whose only crime was enjoying their own bodies. He genuinely believed he was curing them of a dangerous mental illness. His patients, many of whom were committed by their husbands or fathers without their consent, had a different perspective. This is the world we're exploring tonight. A world where women's sexuality was so feared and misunderstood that the medical establishment would rather mutilate women than admit that female pleasure was normal and healthy. A world where a woman's wedding night could be the beginning of a lifetime of trauma disguised as duty. And we haven't even talked about pregnancy yet, or childbirth, or the dozens of ways Victorian medicine found to make women's natural biological functions into pathological nightmares. You see, the Victorians didn't just make sex terrifying for women. They made being a woman terrifying, period. They took every aspect of female biology, from menstruation to menopause, and turned it into evidence of women's fundamental instability and weakness. They created a medical and social system designed to convince women that their own bodies were working against them. But here's what makes this story even more twisted. While they were telling women that sexual desire was a mental illness, they were simultaneously creating a culture that was absolutely saturated with sexual anxiety and obsession. Victorian pornography was a booming industry. Prostitution was everywhere. And the same men who diagnosed their wives with nymphomania for wanting sex once a week were often visiting brothels twice a week. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also the point. Because a system that punishes women for having desires while rewarding men for having the same desires isn't broken. It's working exactly as intended. It's a system designed to keep power concentrated in male hands while keeping women confused, ashamed, and afraid of their own bodies. This is why Victorian women's sexual experiences were so terrifying. It wasn't just that they lacked information, though they did. It wasn't just that they faced physical dangers, though they did. It was that they lived in a world that had weaponized their own sexuality against them. A world that told them their bodies were simultaneously pure and polluted, sacred and shameful, powerful and powerless. And the most terrifying part? Many Victorian women internalized these messages so completely that they became their own jailers. They passed this trauma down to their daughters, disguised as wisdom. They enforced these rules on other women, disguised as morality. They participated in their own oppression because they had been convinced it was for their own good, but not all of them. Because even in the darkest corners of Victorian sexual culture, there were women who resisted. Women who found ways to claim pleasure, knowledge, and autonomy despite everything working against them. Women who wrote secret diaries, formed underground networks, and slowly began to push back against the system that wanted to control them. These women are the real heroes of our story tonight, not because they were perfect, but because they refused to accept that suffering was their natural state. They insisted that women deserved better, even when they couldn't fully imagine what better might look like. And their resistance laid the groundwork for everything that came after. The women's rights movement, the sexual revolution, the ongoing fight for bodily autonomy that we're still fighting today. Because the Victorian war against women's sexuality wasn't just about sex, it was about power, control, and the radical idea that women might be fully human. So as we continue this journey through the twisted landscape of Victorian sexuality, remember that we're not just examining historical curiosities. We're looking at the roots of battles we're still fighting. We're understanding how sexual shame became a tool of oppression and how women have always found ways to resist, even in the darkest times. The gaslit streets of Victorian England are calling, and they have so much more to show us. Now, let's step deeper into the shadows, because what I'm about to tell you will make everything we've discussed so far seem quaint by comparison. We need to talk about Victorian medical practices, and I promise you, this gets so much worse before it gets better. Picture yourself back in that fog-choked London, but this time you're not a bride. You're a woman who's been married for 3 years, and you've developed what your husband considers a troubling habit. You've been reading, not just the Bible or household management guides, but actual books, philosophy, science, literature. You've been asking questions at dinner parties. You've been expressing opinions about politics. And worst of all, you've been enjoying your marital relations just a little too much for Victorian comfort. Your husband is concerned. Your mother-in-law is scandalised. And your family doctor? He has a diagnosis that will chill you to the bone. Welcome to the world of Victorian gynecology, where being an intelligent sexual woman wasn't just frowned upon. It was literally considered a medical emergency. Dr. Horatio Storer, one of the most influential American gynecologists of the era, wrote extensively about what he called the intellectual dangers of female education. He genuinely believed that when women used their brains too much, blood flow was diverted from their reproductive organs, causing their ovaries to atrophy and their uteruses to malfunction. The cure, complete intellectual rest, bland food, and what he delicately termed marital therapy, which was basically prescribed rape. But Storer was practically progressive compared to some of his colleagues. Dr. Edward Clarke, a Harvard Medical School professor, published a book called Sex in Education that argued women's brains and ovaries couldn't function simultaneously. According to Clarke, every hour a woman spent studying was an hour stolen from her reproductive capacity. He recommended that women be forbidden from intellectual activity during menstruation, pregnancy, and basically any time their bodies were doing anything remotely female. These weren't fringe theories. These were mainstream medical beliefs taught in the best universities and practiced in the most respectable hospitals. The Victorian medical establishment had created an entire pseudoscience designed to prove that women's bodies were incompatible with independence, intelligence, or pleasure. And the treatments, they were medieval in their brutality. Let's talk about the rest cure popularised by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell. If you were a woman diagnosed with hysteria, neurasthenia, or any of the dozen other catch-all terms for being an inconvenient woman, you might find yourself subjected to this particular form of medical torture. The rest cure involved complete bed rest for weeks or months. No reading, no writing, no visitors, no stimulation of any kind. You were fed a diet of milk and raw meat to build up your blood. You were isolated from friends and family. You were forbidden from expressing emotions or opinions. The goal was to break your will so completely that you would emerge as a docile, compliant wife who would never again trouble anyone with thoughts or desires of your own. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the feminist writer, was subjected to Mitchell's rest cure and later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper based on her experience. She described it as a form of torture designed to drive women insane rather than cure them. Mitchell's response to her criticism? He claimed that her writing proved the treatment hadn't worked properly. But even the rest cure pales in comparison to what happened to women who were deemed truly incurable. Surgical gynecology in the Victorian era was a horror show that makes medieval medicine look humane. Doctors routinely removed healthy ovaries to cure everything from headaches to rebelliousness. They performed clitoridectomies on women who masturbated or enjoyed sex too much. They inserted leeches into vaginas to treat excessive passion. They cauterized women's genitals with acid to reduce sensitivity. Dr. Robert Batty became famous for pioneering Batty's operation, the surgical removal of normal ovaries to treat hysteria. He performed hundreds of these procedures, often without the patient's informed consent, and boasted about turning raving maniacs into gentle, submissive wives. The mortality rate was astronomical, but Batty considered the surgery a success if the woman emerged more docile, even if she was dying. These weren't back-alley butchers. These were respected members of the medical community, professors at prestigious universities, authors of textbooks that shaped medical practice for generations. They genuinely believed they were helping women by surgically removing their capacity for sexual pleasure and independent thought. And the most terrifying part? Many of these women were committed to asylums or surgical procedures by their own families. A husband who found his wife too headstrong could have her declared hysterical and subjected to any treatment he deemed necessary. A father who disapproved of his daughter's romantic choices could have her institutionalized for nymphomania. A brother who wanted to control his sister's inheritance could have her declared mentally incompetent based on her sexual behavior. The legal system offered no protection. Women had no right to refuse medical treatment. They couldn't divorce abusive husbands without proving extreme cruelty, and enjoying sex was often considered evidence of mental instability rather than abuse. They couldn't own property, vote, or even retain custody of their children if they were declared unfit. But let's zoom out for a moment and look at what was really happening here, because this wasn't just medical malpractice. This was systematic terrorism designed to keep women in line. Think about it. If you're a Victorian woman and you see what happens to women who step out of line, what are you going to do? Are you going to risk expressing your opinions, pursuing your interests, or heaven forbid, admitting that you enjoy sex? Or are you going to keep your head down, fake compliance, and hope nobody notices the fire burning behind your eyes? The Victorian medical establishment had created a perfect system of control. They had pathologized every aspect of female existence, from intelligence to sexuality to independence, and created treatments so horrific that the threat alone was enough to keep most women compliant, and it worked. For generations, women lived in terror of being diagnosed with hysteria, nymphomania, or any of the other pseudo-medical labels that could destroy their lives. They learned to hide their intelligence, fake sexual disinterest, and present themselves as helpless, fragile creatures who needed constant male supervision. But here's where the story takes an interesting turn, because some Victorian women were smarter than the system that was trying to control them. They learned to speak in code. They developed underground networks of information sharing. They found ways to access birth control, sexual knowledge, and medical care that actually helped rather than harmed them. They created secret societies, wrote anonymous pamphlets, and slowly began to fight back against the medical and social forces that were trying to destroy them. Take Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in America. She spent her career fighting against the very medical establishment that had tried to exclude her, documenting the ways Victorian gynecology was harming rather than helping women. She wrote extensively about the connection between women's supposed mental instability and their systematic oppression, arguing that hysteria was often a rational response to irrational circumstances. Or consider the underground network of midwives and wise women who continued to provide women with actual health care, contraception, and abortion services despite the medical establishment's attempts to criminalize their practices. These women risked imprisonment and social ostracism to help other women maintain some control over their own bodies. And then there were the women who found ways to resist from within the system itself. Women who learned to fake symptoms to avoid unwanted medical procedures. Women who developed elaborate codes to share information about sexuality and reproduction. Women who used their supposed fragility as a weapon, manipulating the very stereotypes that oppressed them to carve out spaces of freedom. The Victorian era is often remembered as a time of moral prudishness, but it was actually a time of intense sexual anxiety and violence. The same society that covered piano legs for modesty was performing surgical mutilation on women's genitals. The same culture that swooned over female purity was systematically destroying women who dared to claim any agency over their own bodies. And this violence wasn't random or chaotic. It was carefully organized, scientifically justified, and legally protected. It was a systematic campaign to convince women that their own bodies, minds, and desires were their enemies. But it wasn't just about individual women. This was about maintaining an entire social order built on male dominance. Because a woman who understood her own body, who enjoyed her own sexuality, who trusted her own intelligence, was a woman who might start questioning everything else. Why should she submit to a husband she didn't choose? Why should she be forbidden from owning property or voting? Why should her entire existence be defined by her relationship to men? The Victorian war against women's sexuality was really a war against women's humanity. And the battlefield was women's own bodies. So when we talk about Victorian sexual repression, we're not talking about a quaint historical curiosity. We're talking about a sophisticated system of oppression that used medicine, law, and social pressure to convince women that they were fundamentally broken and needed constant male supervision to function. The fog is getting thicker now, and the gaslight is starting to flicker. But we're not done exploring these dark Victorian streets, because we haven't even talked about what happened to the women who got pregnant, the women who couldn't get pregnant, or the women who tried to avoid getting pregnant altogether. And trust me, those stories will make everything we've discussed so far look like a gentle introduction to Victorian horrors. The gaslight flickers as we turn down an even darker alley of Victorian horror, because now we need to discuss what happened when Victorian women faced the ultimate female experience, pregnancy and childbirth. And I'm warning you now, what you're about to hear will make those surgical mutilations seem like gentle suggestions. You're 19 years old, married for 2 years, and you've just missed your monthly bleeding. In the modern world, this might be cause for celebration or careful planning. In Victorian England, it's the beginning of what could very well be your death sentence. Because here's what nobody talks about when they romanticise the Victorian era. Pregnancy wasn't just dangerous for women, it was a killing field. 1 in 5 women died in childbirth or from pregnancy complications. 1 in 5. Let that sink in for a moment. Every time a Victorian woman became pregnant, she was essentially playing Russian roulette with 5 chambers loaded. But the physical danger was only part of the horror. The moment your pregnancy was confirmed, you ceased to exist as an individual human being. You became a vessel, a walking incubator, whose only value lay in your ability to produce a healthy heir. Your thoughts, feelings, comfort, and even survival became secondary to the precious cargo you were carrying. The medical advice for pregnant Victorian women reads like a manual for psychological torture. You were forbidden from reading anything stimulating, lest you mark the baby with your thoughts. You couldn't attend theatre or look at disturbing images. You weren't allowed to experience strong emotions of any kind. One popular medical text warned that if a pregnant woman saw a disabled person, her child might be born with the same disability. If she craved strawberries and couldn't get them, the baby might be born with a strawberry-shaped birthmark. This wasn't just superstition. This was medical doctrine, taught in universities and practiced by licensed physicians. Victorian doctors genuinely believed that a woman's thoughts, emotions, and experiences during pregnancy could physically alter her developing child. So pregnant women lived in a state of constant terror, afraid that any wrong thought or feeling might damn their unborn children. And the restrictions got more bizarre the longer you were pregnant. You couldn't raise your arms above your head or the umbilical cord might strangle the baby. You couldn't look in mirrors or the child might be born vain. You couldn't attend funerals or the baby might be born dead. You couldn't have sexual relations with your husband or you might give birth to a monster. But perhaps most cruelly, you weren't allowed to express fear about childbirth itself, because admitting you were terrified of the very real possibility of dying in agony was considered harmful to the baby. So Victorian women spent 9 months in silent terror, forbidden from even acknowledging the danger they faced. The birthing process itself was designed to maximize suffering while minimizing a woman's control over her own experience. Most Victorian women gave birth at home, attended by female relatives and maybe a midwife if they were lucky. Doctors were considered inappropriate for childbirth unless there were serious complications, which meant that by the time medical help arrived, it was often too late. The birthing position mandated by Victorian medical practice was lying flat on your back, which we now know is one of the worst possible positions for labour, but it wasn't chosen for the woman's comfort or safety. It was chosen because it gave attending physicians the best view and access, turning childbirth into a medical spectacle rather than a natural process. Pain relief was not just unavailable, it was considered morally wrong. The Bible said women should suffer in childbirth as punishment for Eve's sin, and Victorian doctors took this literally. When chloroform was first introduced as an anaesthetic in the 1840s, many physicians refused to use it for labouring women, arguing that pain was God's will and that eliminating it was tantamount to interfering with divine justice. Queen Victoria herself had to intervene before chloroform became acceptable for childbirth. When she used it during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853, it became known as anaesthesia à la reine, and suddenly upper-class women could access pain relief. But working-class women continued to suffer without relief for decades longer, because their pain was considered less important than their social betters. But let's talk about what happened when things went wrong during childbirth, because this is where Victorian medical practice revealed its true barbarism. Obstructed labour was common in an era of poor nutrition and undiagnosed health conditions. When a baby couldn't be delivered naturally, Victorian doctors had a toolkit of procedures that would make medieval torture devices seem humane. They would crush the baby's skull inside the womb and extract it piece by piece. They would break the baby's bones to make it smaller. They would turn the baby and pull it out by whatever limb they could grasp, often tearing both mother and child in the process. Caesarean sections were available, but rarely performed because the mortality rate was nearly 100%. In an era before antibiotics or proper sterilisation, cutting open a woman's abdomen was essentially a death sentence with a small chance of saving the baby, so doctors would exhaust every other option, no matter how brutal, before resorting to surgery. And if the mother died in childbirth, which happened with horrifying frequency, the response was often to immediately blame her for her own death. She must have been too delicate, too emotional, too disobedient to medical advice. Her death was treated as a moral failing rather than a medical tragedy. The survivors often faced a lifetime of complications that Victorian medicine was powerless to address. Obstetric fistulas, where tears between the vagina and bladder or rectum caused constant incontinence, were common but rarely repaired successfully. Many women lived the rest of their lives as social outcasts, unable to control their bodily functions and blamed for their condition. But childbirth was only one way pregnancy could kill you. Victorian women also faced the constant threat of miscarriage, which was often blamed on their own moral failings. If you lost a baby, it was because you had impure thoughts, engaged in inappropriate activities, or failed to follow medical advice. The grief of losing a child was compounded by the social assumption that you were somehow responsible for the loss. And then there were the women who faced the opposite problem. They couldn't get pregnant at all. Infertility in Victorian times wasn't just a medical condition, it was a social death sentence. A woman who couldn't conceive was considered fundamentally broken, a failed woman who had no purpose in society. The treatments for infertility were as brutal and ineffective as everything else in Victorian gynecology. Doctors would prescribe painful procedures, dangerous medications, and psychological torture disguised as therapy. Some physicians recommended what they called mechanical assistance, which involved inserting various devices into women's bodies to supposedly stimulate conception. Others prescribed medications containing mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that often poisoned the women they were meant to help. But the cruelest treatment was psychological. Infertile women were told they were too intellectual, too independent, too sexual, or not sexual enough. They were blamed for their condition and told that if they could just learn to be proper women, they would naturally conceive. The stress and shame of infertility often drove women to desperate measures, including seeking help from folk healers and charlatans who promised miracle cures. And what about the women who wanted to avoid pregnancy altogether? Well, that's where Victorian hypocrisy reached its absolute peak. Contraception was illegal, immoral, and supposedly medically dangerous. The Comstock laws in America and similar legislation in Britain made it a crime to distribute information about birth control. Doctors who provided contraceptive advice could lose their licenses. Women who sought to limit their pregnancies were considered unnatural and selfish. But here's the thing, Victorian families were actually getting smaller during this period. The birth rate was declining steadily throughout the 19th century, which means women were finding ways to control their fertility despite all the legal and social barriers. They were using withdrawal, rhythm methods, douching with various chemicals, and inserting barriers made of everything from sea sponges to crocodile dung. They were seeking out folk remedies and underground networks of information sharing. They were risking their lives and freedom to gain some control over their own reproductive capacity. And when contraception failed, they turned to abortion, which was both illegal and incredibly dangerous. Back alley abortions using coat hangers, knitting needles, and toxic chemicals killed thousands of women every year. But for many Victorian women, the risk of death from illegal abortion seemed preferable to the certainty of poverty, social ostracism, or death in childbirth. The hypocrisy was staggering. The same society that criminalised contraception and abortion also punished women for having too many children. Poor families were blamed for their poverty and told they shouldn't reproduce if they couldn't afford children. Unmarried mothers were cast out as moral failures. Women who died in childbirth were blamed for their own deaths. Victorian society had created a system where women could never win. They were punished for being sexual and punished for avoiding sexuality. They were condemned for having children and condemned for not having children. They were blamed when pregnancies went wrong and blamed when they tried to prevent pregnancies altogether. But perhaps most insidiously, the Victorian medical establishment had convinced many women that this suffering was natural, inevitable, and even morally necessary. They were told that pain in childbirth was God's will, that infertility was divine punishment, that pregnancy complications were the result of their own moral failings. This internalized shame was passed down from mother to daughter for generations. Victorian women taught their children that female suffering was noble, that enduring pain without complaint was the highest form of virtue, that questioning medical authority was both dangerous and immoral. The result was a culture of female martyrdom that persisted long after the Victorian era ended. Women who had survived the medical horrors of the 19th century taught their daughters to expect suffering, to distrust their own bodies, and to submit to male medical authority without question. And yet, even in this landscape of terror and oppression, some women found ways to resist. They formed underground networks to share contraceptive information. They supported each other through dangerous pregnancies and illegal abortions. They began to question the medical orthodoxy that treated their bodies as inherently defective. The women's rights movement that emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries wasn't just about voting or property rights. It was about reclaiming women's bodies from a medical and social system that had weaponized reproduction against them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because there's one more aspect of Victorian women's sexual experience that we haven't fully explored yet. We've talked about marriage, medical torture, and reproductive horror. Now we need to discuss what happened to the women who fell outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable female behaviour altogether. The prostitutes, the unmarried mothers, the women who loved other women, the women who refused to conform to Victorian ideals of femininity. Because their stories reveal just how far Victorian society was willing to go to punish women who dared to claim any autonomy over their own bodies and desires. And trust me, those tales of rebellion and punishment will make everything we've discussed so far seem like a gentle warm-up to the real horrors of Victorian sexual control. The fog is getting thicker, the shadows deeper, and the gaslight more uncertain. But we're not done walking these treacherous streets yet, because the women on the margins of Victorian society have stories that need to be told, and secrets that will illuminate the true depths of Victorian sexual terrorism. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with something you don't want to identify as we turn toward the darkest corners of Victorian London. Because now we need to talk about the women who existed outside the suffocating boundaries of respectable society. The prostitutes, the fallen women, the unmarried mothers, and the women who dared to love other women in a world that had no language for their desires except sin and sickness. If you thought married women had it bad, wait until you see what happened to women who stepped outside the protective prison of marriage altogether. Let's start with prostitution, because Victorian England had a relationship with sex work that was so hypocritical it would be funny if it weren't so deadly. On one hand, prostitution was the great moral evil, the corruption that threatened to destroy Christian civilization. On the other hand, it was absolutely everywhere, tacitly accepted as necessary for maintaining social order, and patronized by the very men who publicly condemned it. The numbers are staggering. In 1850s London, police estimated there were over 80,000 prostitutes working in the city. That's roughly one sex worker for every 20 residents, including children. These weren't just streetwalkers either. There were high-class courtesans entertaining members of parliament, brothel madames running sophisticated operations, and desperate women selling themselves for the price of a meal. But here's what Victorian society didn't want to acknowledge. Most of these women weren't there by choice. They were there because the economic system had failed them so completely that selling their bodies was literally the only way to survive. A seamstress working 16 hours a day might earn enough to afford a corner of a shared room and one meal. A governess, one of the few respectable jobs available to educated women, earned so little that many supplemented their income with part-time sex work. Domestic servants who became pregnant were thrown out without references, making prostitution their only option for survival. And once you were labelled a fallen woman, there was no way back. Victorian society had created a system where one sexual mistake, one moment of desperation, one act of rebellion could brand you for life as irredeemably corrupt. The contagious diseases. Acts of the 1860s revealed just how systematically Victorian society was willing to torture women in the name of protecting men's health. These laws allowed police to arrest any woman suspected of being a prostitute and force her to undergo internal examinations for venereal disease. If she was found to be infected, she could be locked up in a hospital prison for months of brutal treatment with mercury and other toxic remedies. Notice what's missing here. Any examination or treatment of the men who were actually spreading these diseases. The acts assumed that women were the source of sexual contamination and men were innocent victims, despite the obvious fact that men were the ones creating the demand for prostitution in the first place. Josephine Butler, one of the few Victorian reformers who actually gave a damn about sex workers' welfare, described these examinations as state-sanctioned rape. Women were strapped to tables and penetrated with metal instruments by male doctors who treated them like diseased animals rather than human beings. Many women who weren't even prostitutes were subjected to these examinations based solely on their appearance, behaviour, or social class. The psychological impact was devastating. Women lived in constant terror of being arrested, examined, and branded as prostitutes whether they were or not. The threat alone was enough to keep most women locked in their homes after dark, afraid that simply being on the street might be interpreted as solicitation. But the contagious diseases acts also revealed something else. Victorian men's absolute terror of female sexuality when it wasn't under their direct control. A woman who sold sex was dangerous, not just because she might spread disease, but because she represented female desire operating outside the boundaries of marriage and male ownership. The medical establishment responded to this threat with characteristic brutality. Prostitutes were studied like laboratory specimens, their bodies dissected after death to find the supposed physiological markers of moral corruption. Doctors claimed they could identify prostitutes by examining their genitals, measuring their skulls, or analysing their facial features. Dr. Parent du Châtelet, whose work on prostitution was widely read in Victorian England, argued that prostitutes were essentially a different species from respectable women. He claimed they had enlarged clitorises, unusual vaginal formations, and brain abnormalities that predisposed them to sexual deviance. This wasn't just prejudice disguised as science. This was a systematic attempt to dehumanize women who dared to claim any agency over their own sexuality. And what about the women who worked in the sex trade but tried to maintain some dignity and autonomy? They faced a special kind of hell. High-class courtesans who catered to wealthy clients lived in constant fear of exposure and social destruction. They might earn enough money to live comfortably, but they could never truly own property, form lasting relationships, or escape the stigma of their profession. One client's vindictive wife, one jealous rival, one newspaper scandal could destroy them overnight. The madames who ran brothels faced prosecution, violence from both clients and competitors, and the constant threat of police raids. They had to navigate a world where their businesses were simultaneously illegal and tolerated, where they needed protection from the very authorities who were supposed to shut them down. And the streetwalkers, the women at the bottom of the sex work hierarchy, faced dangers that would make your blood run cold. Jack the Ripper wasn't an anomaly. He was just the most famous of countless men who preyed on women who had no legal protection, no social standing, and no one to mourn them when they disappeared. The police response to violence against prostitutes was telling. When respectable women were attacked, it was a crime against society. When prostitutes were murdered, it was treated as an occupational hazard. The message was clear. Once you were labelled a fallen woman, your life had no value. But prostitution wasn't the only way women could find themselves cast out of respectable society. Unmarried pregnancy was another one-way ticket to social death. If you were an unmarried woman who became pregnant in Victorian England, you had three basic options, all of them horrific. You could try to procure an illegal abortion and risk death from infection or poison. You could give birth and abandon the baby to a foundling hospital where it would almost certainly die. Or you could keep the child and live as a social outcast for the rest of your life. The baby farms that proliferated in Victorian cities were essentially infant death camps disguised as childcare services. Desperate unmarried mothers would pay women to care for their children, knowing full well that the babies would be slowly murdered through neglect, starvation, and deliberate poisoning. It was infanticide with plausible deniability, and everyone involved knew exactly what was happening. Amelia Dyer, one of the most prolific serial killers in British history, murdered hundreds of babies through her baby farming operation. When she was finally caught and executed in 1896, the public was shocked not by the scale of her crimes, but by the fact that someone had finally been held accountable for a practice that was widespread and tacitly accepted. The alternative was keeping your illegitimate child and facing a lifetime of poverty, shame, and social exclusion. Unmarried mothers were barred from most employment, denied poor relief, and treated as moral pariahs. Their children were bastards with no legal rights, no inheritance, and no social standing. The workhouses where destitute unmarried mothers ended up were designed to be so miserable that death seemed preferable. Women were separated from their children, forced to perform brutal labour, fed starvation rations, and subjected to constant moral lectures about their fallen state. Many went mad, many died, all were broken. And then there were the women whose crime was loving other women in a world that had no concept of female homosexuality except as a form of mental illness or moral corruption. Victorian society was so invested in the myth of female sexual passivity that they literally couldn't conceive of women having sexual relationships with each other. The idea that women might desire each other sexually was so threatening to the entire structure of patriarchal society that it was simply denied out of existence. When women did form romantic relationships with each other, they were forced to hide behind elaborate facades of friendship, sisterly affection, or economic necessity. Some women lived as married couples for decades, sharing homes, beds, and lives, while society willfully ignored the obvious nature of their relationship. Others weren't so lucky. Women who were too open about their romantic attachments to other women could find themselves diagnosed with hysteria, nymphomania, or any number of pseudo-medical conditions that justified imprisonment, medical torture, or commitment to asylums. The case of Alice Mitchell and Frida Ward in 1892 shocked Victorian society, not because of their lesbian relationship, but because it forced people to acknowledge that such relationships existed at all. When 19-year-old Alice murdered her former lover Frida rather than lose her to a man, the trial became a sensation that revealed the depths of Victorian ignorance and prejudice about female sexuality. Alice was declared insane, not because she had committed murder, but because the idea of a woman loving another woman sexually was literally incomprehensible to Victorian minds. The trial testimony revealed that neither Alice nor Frida had any understanding of what their feelings meant or how to express them in a society that denied their very existence. The women who managed to maintain long-term relationships with other women did so by becoming invisible, by living lives of such careful respectability that no one would dare question their arrangements. They were spinster teachers who shared houses for economic reasons. They were maiden aunts who never married and devoted themselves to each other's care. They were widows who found comfort in female companionship. But this invisibility came at a cost. These women had to deny their own desires so completely that many of them internalized the shame and self-hatred that Victorian society projected onto them. They lived in constant fear of exposure, discovery, and the destruction that would follow. Some found refuge in women-only spaces like nursing, teaching, or missionary work, where close female relationships were not only tolerated but encouraged. But even there, they had to be careful not to be too affectionate, too exclusive, or too obviously devoted to each other. The letters and diaries that survive from these relationships reveal the same patterns of longing, frustration, and desperate love that characterized heterosexual relationships, but with an added layer of terror and secrecy. These women knew that discovery meant not just social death, but potential medical intervention, family rejection, and complete isolation. And yet, despite all these dangers, despite the complete absence of any social support or legal recognition, some Victorian women found ways to love each other deeply and authentically. They created their own language of devotion, their own rituals of commitment, their own small rebellions against a world that wanted to erase them. These hidden relationships reveal something crucial about Victorian sexual culture. The official ideology of female passivity and purity was so far removed from reality that it required constant, violent enforcement to maintain. Women kept falling in love, feeling desire, claiming pleasure, and forming relationships that threatened the entire structure of patriarchal control. The response was always the same: more surveillance, more punishment, more medical intervention, more legal restrictions. Victorian society was locked in an endless war against female sexuality, and that war required increasingly brutal tactics to maintain even the appearance of victory. But here's what the Victorians never understood. You can't actually destroy human sexuality through punishment and shame. You can drive it underground, distort it, traumatize the people who experience it, and create generations of psychological damage. But you can't eliminate it. And so Victorian women found ways to resist, even in the darkest circumstances. Prostitutes formed mutual aid societies to protect each other from violence and exploitation. Unmarried mothers created underground networks to share information about contraception and abortion. Women in love with other women developed coded languages and secret signals that allowed them to find each other across the vast loneliness of Victorian society. These acts of resistance were small, often invisible, and almost always dangerous, but they laid the groundwork for everything that came after. The women's rights movement, the fight for reproductive freedom, the struggle for sexual autonomy that continues today. Because the Victorian war against women's sexuality wasn't just about controlling individual women. It was about maintaining an entire social order built on the systematic subordination of half the human race. And that order could only be maintained through constant violence, constant surveillance, and constant terror. The women who resisted, who refused to accept that suffering was their natural state, who insisted on their right to love, desire, and choose, were fighting for more than just personal freedom. They were fighting for a vision of humanity that included women as full human beings rather than property, vessels, or moral symbols. Their victories were small and hard won, their defeats were crushing and often fatal, but their courage in the face of systematic oppression reminds us that even in the darkest times, even under the most brutal circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to resist, to love, and to hope. The gaslight is flickering more desperately now, and the fog has grown so thick you can barely see your own hands. But we're not quite finished with our journey through Victorian sexual horror, because there's one more layer to this nightmare that we haven't fully explored yet. We've talked about the medical torture, the legal oppression, the social control, and the punishment of women who stepped outside accepted boundaries. But now we need to discuss how all of this systematic abuse was justified, rationalized, and made to seem not just normal, but necessary and moral. We need to talk about the ideology that made Victorian sexual terrorism possible, and how that ideology shaped not just individual relationships, but entire institutions, laws, and cultural beliefs that persisted long after the Victorian era ended. Because understanding how the Victorians convinced themselves that torturing women was good for them is crucial to understanding how similar systems of oppression operate today, and how we can recognize and resist them when they emerge in new forms. The shadows are growing longer, and the night is far from over. Stay close, because what we're about to discover will illuminate not just the past, but the present and future as well. The fog swirls thicker around us as we approach the heart of Victorian darkness, because now we need to examine the machinery of justification that made all this horror seem not just acceptable, but righteous. This is where we discover how an entire civilization convinced itself that systematically terrorizing women was actually a form of love, protection, and moral duty. You see, the Victorians didn't wake up one morning and decide to torture women for fun. They built an elaborate philosophical and religious framework that transformed cruelty into kindness, oppression into protection, and systematic abuse into moral necessity. And understanding this framework is crucial, because versions of it are still operating today. Let's start with the cornerstone of Victorian sexual ideology, the cult of true womanhood. This wasn't just a social expectation, it was a religious doctrine that defined women's very essence through four sacred virtues: piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. These weren't just nice qualities to have, they were the fundamental requirements of female humanity. A woman who was impious, impure, rebellious, or interested in anything outside the home wasn't just behaving badly, she was violating the natural order of creation itself. She was rebelling against God, nature, and civilization all at once, and such rebellion had to be corrected, no matter how painful the correction might be. The beauty of this system was its circular logic. If a woman suffered under Victorian sexual restrictions, that suffering was proof of her virtue. If she complained about the suffering, that complaint was proof of her corruption. If she tried to escape the suffering, That attempt was evidence that she needed even more restriction and control. Take the medical establishment's approach to female pain. When Victorian doctors performed clitoridectomies or removed healthy ovaries, they genuinely believed they were saving women from themselves. They had convinced themselves that female sexual pleasure was a form of mental illness, and that surgical removal of the capacity for pleasure was therefore a cure, not a mutilation. Dr. Isaac Baker Brown, who performed hundreds of these procedures, wrote extensively about his compassion for the poor women suffering from nymphomania and hysteria. He saw himself as a healer, a saviour, a man so enlightened that he could see through women's protests to their deeper need for medical intervention. When women begged him not to mutilate them, he interpreted their pleas as symptoms of the very disease he was treating. This wasn't sadism disguised as medicine. This was something far more dangerous, genuine conviction that cruelty was kindness. Brown and his colleagues had created a worldview so complete, so internally consistent, that it could absorb any evidence that contradicted it and transform that evidence into proof of its own correctness. The religious establishment provided the theological backing for this medical terrorism. Victorian Christianity had developed an elaborate doctrine of female spiritual inferiority that made women's suffering seem not just inevitable, but divinely ordained. Women were the daughters of Eve, forever tainted by original sin and forever responsible for leading men into temptation. Their pain in childbirth was explicitly mandated by God as punishment for Eve's disobedience. Their subordination to men was a direct command from Scripture. Their exclusion from public life was necessary to protect society from their inherently corrupting influence. But here's the truly insidious part. This theology also taught that women's suffering was redemptive. Through pain, submission, and self-denial, women could partially atone for Eve's sin and achieve a kind of secondary salvation. The more a woman suffered, the more holy she became. The more she denied herself, the more worthy she was of divine love. This created a psychological trap that was almost impossible to escape. Women who rebelled against their suffering were rejecting not just social expectations, but the very path to salvation itself. They were choosing damnation over redemption, sin over sanctity, selfishness over divine love. And the women who internalized this message most completely were often the ones who enforced it most brutally on other women. Mothers who had been broken by the system taught their daughters that breaking was necessary. Women who had survived medical torture convinced themselves it had been beneficial. Wives who had endured years of marital rape became the fiercest advocates for wifely submission. The legal system provided the practical framework for transforming ideology into reality. Victorian law didn't just permit the oppression of women. It mandated it, regulated it, and provided detailed instructions for how it should be carried out. The doctrine of coverture meant that married women ceased to exist as legal persons. They couldn't own property, sign contracts, sue in court, or even maintain custody of their own children. Their husbands owned their bodies, their labour, their thoughts, and their futures. This wasn't just custom, it was law backed by centuries of legal precedent and enforced by courts, police, and the full power of the state. When a woman was committed to an asylum for hysteria or nymphomania, it wasn't arbitrary violence. It was due process. There were forms to fill out, doctors to consult, legal procedures to follow. The law provided a complete bureaucratic framework for destroying women's lives while maintaining the appearance of justice and rationality. The economic system ensured that most women had no choice but to submit to this legal and medical terrorism. Women were systematically excluded from most forms of employment, denied access to education, and prevented from accumulating wealth or property. The few jobs available to women paid so little that economic independence was virtually impossible. This created a situation where marriage wasn't just a social expectation, it was an economic necessity, and once married, women found themselves trapped in relationships they couldn't legally or financially escape. No matter how abusive those relationships became, the genius of Victorian oppression was that it made resistance seem not just futile, but actively harmful to the women who attempted it. A woman who tried to claim independence would find herself unable to support herself economically. A woman who sought divorce would lose custody of her children and social standing. A woman who complained about medical treatment would be diagnosed with additional mental illnesses requiring more invasive intervention. Every exit was blocked. Every act of resistance was pathologized. Every attempt at escape was used as evidence that more control was necessary. But perhaps most importantly, the Victorian system had convinced many women that they didn't want to escape. It had so thoroughly redefined female nature, female happiness, and female fulfillment that many women genuinely believed their oppression was their liberation. The cult of domesticity taught women that finding joy in anything outside the home was unnatural and ultimately unfulfilling. The ideology of romantic love convinced them that submitting to their husbands was the highest form of emotional expression. The doctrine of maternal sacrifice persuaded them that denying themselves was the purest form of love for their children. Women who had internalized these messages didn't feel oppressed. They felt elevated, special, morally superior to the men who lacked their capacity for self-sacrifice and spiritual refinement. They saw their restrictions as protections, their limitations as privileges, their suffering as evidence of their moral superiority. This psychological transformation was the ultimate victory of Victorian sexual ideology. It had created a system so complete that its victims became its most enthusiastic defenders. The cultural apparatus that supported this system was vast and sophisticated. Literature, art, music, fashion, architecture, education, journalism, and popular entertainment all worked together to reinforce the message that women's subordination was natural, necessary, and beautiful. The angel in the house became the central figure of Victorian literature, a woman so pure, so selfless, so devoted to others that she barely seemed human. This literary ideal wasn't just entertainment, it was instruction, showing women what they should aspire to become, and men what they should expect from their wives and daughters. Fashion reinforced the message through clothing that made independent movement almost impossible. Corsets that restricted breathing, skirts that prevented walking at normal speed, shoes that made running dangerous. Women's clothes were designed to transform them into decorative objects rather than functional human beings. Architecture separated women from public life through the creation of distinct domestic spaces. The Victorian home became a fortress designed to keep women in and the world out. Drawing rooms, morning rooms, ladies' parlors, all spaces designed to contain female activity within acceptable boundaries. Education for women focused exclusively on ornamental accomplishments that would make them more attractive to potential husbands but would not prepare them for independent life. A little music, a little French, a little watercolour painting, just enough culture to be entertaining but not enough knowledge to be dangerous. The press reinforced these messages through constant coverage of women who had violated social expectations and suffered appropriate consequences. Fallen women, rebellious wives, unfeminine activists, all presented as cautionary tales rather than examples of resistance. Even science was enlisted in the cause. Phrenology claimed to prove that women's skulls showed they were naturally suited for domestic rather than intellectual pursuits. Evolutionary biology argued that women's smaller brains made them incapable of abstract thought. Medical research discovered that education damaged women's reproductive capacity. This wasn't just prejudice masquerading as scholarship, this was a coordinated intellectual campaign to provide scientific justification for women's subordination. The same universities that trained doctors to mutilate women's genitals also trained anthropologists to measure women's skulls, psychologists to study women's mental deficiencies, and biologists to document women's evolutionary inferiority. The result was a complete worldview that made Victorian sexual terrorism seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. If women were naturally inferior, naturally hysterical, naturally suited only for domestic life, then of course they needed constant supervision and control. If they complained about that control, their complaints were just further evidence of their natural instability. And here's the most chilling part. This system worked exactly as intended. It produced generations of women who accepted their subordination as natural, who passed that acceptance on to their daughters, and who actively resisted attempts at liberation. When the first wave of feminism began to challenge Victorian sexual ideology, some of the fiercest opposition came from women themselves. Women who had been so thoroughly conditioned to see their oppression as protection that they genuinely feared what would happen if that protection was removed. The anti-suffrage movement was led largely by upper-class women who argued that voting would corrupt women's pure nature and destroy their special role as moral guardians of society. These women weren't traitors to their sex. They were the perfect products of a system that had convinced them their chains were jewellery. But the system had a fatal flaw. It was built on lies, and lies eventually collapse under the weight of reality. No matter how sophisticated the justification, no matter how complete the indoctrination, human beings have an innate drive toward freedom and dignity that can't be permanently suppressed. Some Victorian women began to see through the elaborate ideological framework that justified their oppression. They noticed that the men who claimed to be protecting them were often the ones harming them. They observed that the medical treatments designed to cure them usually made them sicker. They realised that the restrictions imposed for their own good seemed primarily to benefit others. These women began to ask dangerous questions. If women were naturally unsuited for intellectual work, why did they have to be forbidden from pursuing it? If they were naturally submissive, why did submission have to be enforced so brutally? If they were naturally fulfilled by domestic life, why did so many of them seem miserable in their homes? The answers to these questions revealed the fundamental contradictions at the heart of Victorian sexual ideology. Women weren't naturally inferior. They were artificially constrained. They weren't naturally hysterical. They were driven to hysteria by impossible circumstances. They weren't naturally suited only for domestic life. They were prevented from exploring any alternatives. This recognition was the beginning of the end for Victorian sexual terrorism. Once enough women understood that their suffering wasn't natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained, they could begin to organise resistance. But that resistance would take decades to build, and generations to achieve any meaningful success. The Victorian system of sexual oppression was so deeply embedded in law, medicine, religion, culture, and psychology that dismantling it would require nothing less than a complete transformation of society. And even today, more than a century after the Victorian era ended, we're still dealing with the legacy of Victorian sexual ideology. The belief that women's bodies are inherently problematic, that female sexuality is dangerous, that women's primary value lies in their reproductive capacity, that women who step outside traditional roles are unnatural or mentally ill. All of these ideas have Victorian roots. Understanding this history isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about recognising how systems of oppression work, how they justify themselves, and how they can be resisted. The Victorian war against women's sexuality was ultimately a war against women's humanity. It was an attempt to reduce half the human race to a set of biological functions and social roles, to deny women's capacity for independent thought, autonomous choice, and self-determination. The fog is beginning to lift now, and the gaslight is growing steadier. But our journey through Victorian sexual horror isn't quite over yet, because we need to understand how this system finally began to crumble, how women found ways to resist that couldn't be pathologized or criminalized, and how the courage of individual women eventually grew into movements that would transform the world. The shadows are still deep, but there's light beginning to break through, and that light will show us not just how the Victorian nightmare ended, but how we can recognize and resist when similar nightmares try to emerge in new forms. The cobblestones beneath our feet are beginning to reflect something other than gaslight, something that looks suspiciously like dawn. But dawn is still hours away, and before we can see the light, we need to descend into the deepest circle of Victorian sexual hell. Because there's one final horror we haven't fully explored yet, one that makes everything else we've discussed seem like a gentle introduction to true depravity. We need to talk about Victorian childhood, because if you thought adult women had it bad, wait until you see what this society did to little girls in the name of preparing them for womanhood. You're 8 years old, living in a respectable middle-class household in Manchester, 1870. You've just been caught touching yourself, exploring your own body with the innocent curiosity of a child who doesn't yet understand that her body is supposed to be a source of shame rather than wonder. Your mother finds you, and the look of absolute horror on her face tells you that you've committed some unthinkable sin, though you have no idea what. What happens next will haunt you for the rest of your life. Victorian child-rearing manuals are filled with detailed instructions for preventing and punishing childhood masturbation, as if the natural curiosity of children about their own bodies was evidence of demonic possession. The recommended treatments read like torture manuals disguised as parenting advice. Dr. Sylvester Graham, whose name survives today on crackers, recommended that parents tie their children's hands to bedposts every night to prevent nocturnal self-exploration. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, yes, the cereal man, advocated for applying carbolic acid to little girls' clitorises to make touching painful enough to discourage repetition. These weren't fringe lunatics. These were respected medical authorities whose advice was followed by thousands of well-meaning parents. The psychological damage was immediate and lasting. Victorian children, especially girls, learned before they could properly read that their bodies were sources of shame, that curiosity about sexuality was evil, and that any pleasure they might feel was evidence of their fundamental corruption. But the real horror wasn't just the punishment. It was the complete absence of any honest information about what was happening to their bodies as they grew up. Victorian girls reached puberty with no understanding of menstruation, sexuality, or reproduction. Their first period often came as a complete shock, interpreted as illness, injury, or divine punishment. Many girls genuinely believed they were dying when they began to bleed, because no one had bothered to explain that this was a normal part of a female development. The euphemisms and evasions that surrounded female biology created a fog of ignorance so thick that girls couldn't even ask questions about their own bodies. Menstruation was the curse, being unwell, or the monthly sickness. Pregnancy was an interesting condition, or expecting. Sexual intercourse was marital duty, or simply unmentionable. This deliberate ignorance wasn't an accident. It was a carefully constructed system designed to keep girls helpless, dependent, and unable to make informed decisions about their own bodies and futures. A girl who didn't understand how pregnancy occurred couldn't protect herself from unwanted conception. A girl who had never been told that sexual activity could be pleasurable wouldn't know to expect anything more than painful submission. A girl who believed her body was fundamentally shameful and dangerous wouldn't trust her own instincts or desires. The education that Victorian girls did receive was specifically designed to reinforce their future subordination. They learned to read, but only so they could study religious texts and household management guides. They learned to write, but only to maintain domestic correspondence and record household expenses. They learned arithmetic, but only enough to manage servants and plan meals. Any education that might lead to independence, critical thinking, or professional competence was not just discouraged, but actively prevented. Girls who showed too much intellectual curiosity were diagnosed with brain fever and treated with rest cures that would destroy their capacity for sustained thought. The physical restrictions placed on Victorian girls were designed to ensure they would grow up weak, dependent, and incapable of vigorous activity. Tight corseting began in early childhood, permanently deforming their rib cages and internal organs. They were forbidden from running, climbing, or engaging in any activity that might develop physical strength or confidence. The message was clear: girls were fragile creatures who needed constant protection and supervision. They couldn't be trusted to make decisions about their own activities, their own bodies, or their own futures. And then at the peak of their physical and intellectual development, these deliberately weakened and ignorant girls were handed over to men they barely knew, in marriages arranged by their fathers for economic or social advantage. The transition from protected daughter to submissive wife happened overnight, with no preparation except the vague warning that marriage involved unpleasant duties that good women endured without complaint. Is it any wonder that so many Victorian women suffered nervous breakdowns, hysteria, and what we would now recognise as severe depression and anxiety? They had been systematically trained from birth to be helpless, ignorant, and afraid of their own bodies and desires. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because the Victorian obsession with female purity and innocence created a market for its opposite that was both vast and horrifying. The same society that worshipped the angel in the house also created an enormous demand for fallen women, prostitutes, and victims of sexual violence. Victorian men, raised to believe that respectable women were pure and passionless, sought outlets for their sexuality among women who had been marked as already corrupted. This created a system where some women were elevated to impossible standards of purity, while others were degraded beyond recognition of their humanity. And the pipeline between these two categories was much shorter than Victorian society wanted to admit. A respectable girl who was seduced, raped, or simply unlucky enough to be caught in a compromising situation could find herself cast out of polite society and forced into prostitution for survival. Once fallen, there was no path back to respectability. She became a cautionary tale for other girls, and a commodity for men who wanted to experience sexuality without the constraints of marriage. The age of consent in Victorian England was 12 until 1875, when it was raised to 13. Think about that for a moment. A 12-year-old girl could legally consent to sexual activity with an adult man. The concept of childhood sexual abuse barely existed in legal terms. This legal framework enabled the systematic sexual exploitation of children, particularly poor children who had no family protection or social standing. The London slums were filled with girls as young as 10 or 11, selling themselves to survive, and this was treated as an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of urban life rather than a crime against children. The feminist journalist W.T. Stead shocked Victorian society in 1885 when he published The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, an exposé of child prostitution in London. To prove his point about how easy it was to purchase a child for sexual purposes, he actually bought a 13-year-old girl named Eliza Armstrong from her mother for £5. The public outcry that followed Stead's revelations led to the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, which raised the age of consent to 16. But the law did nothing to address the economic and social conditions that forced children into prostitution in the first place. Poor families continued to sell their daughters to survive. Workhouses continued to turn out girls with no skills except domestic service and no protection from sexual exploitation. The industrial economy continued to pay women wages so low that supplementing income through part-time sex work was often the only alternative to starvation. And the middle and upper classes continued to pretend that child sexual abuse was a problem confined to the lower orders. something that happened to other people's children in distant slums rather than in their own respectable households. But the truth was that sexual abuse was endemic throughout Victorian society, hidden behind closed doors and covered up by families desperate to protect their reputations. Girls who were molested by fathers, uncles, brothers, or family friends had no language to describe what was happening to them, and no one who would believe them if they tried to speak. The cult of family privacy meant that what happened within the home was beyond outside scrutiny or intervention. A father's authority over his children was considered absolute, and that authority included sexual access if he chose to claim it. The medical establishment actively enabled this abuse by pathologizing children's natural responses to trauma. A girl who became withdrawn, anxious, or rebellious after being sexually abused would be diagnosed with hysteria, moral insanity, or precocious sexuality rather than being recognized as a victim of crime. Dr. Henry Maudsley, one of the most influential Victorian psychiatrists, wrote extensively about the moral imbecility of children who displayed sexual knowledge or behaviour. He recommended that such children be institutionalised to prevent them from corrupting other children, never considering that their sexual knowledge might have come from adult abuse rather than inherent depravity. This medical framework turned victims into patients and crimes into symptoms. It protected abusers by redefining their actions as responses to their victims' pathological behaviour rather than expressions of their own criminal intent. The result was a society where childhood sexual abuse was simultaneously widespread and invisible, enabled by law, medicine, and social custom, while being denied and covered up by the very institutions that should have been protecting children. And the girls who survived this abuse carried its effects into their adult lives, often without understanding what had happened to them or why they felt so damaged and ashamed. They became the Victorian women we've been discussing, the wives who couldn't enjoy sexuality, the mothers who passed trauma down to their daughters, the patients who filled asylums and doctors' offices with complaints that had no medical explanation. The Victorian war against women's sexuality wasn't just about controlling adult women. It was about creating those women through systematic childhood trauma, deliberate ignorance, and the complete denial of girls' humanity and autonomy. Every aspect of Victorian society worked together to ensure that girls would grow up damaged, dependent, and unable to recognise their own worth or claim their own power. The legal system that made them property, the medical establishment that pathologised their natural development, the educational system that kept them ignorant, the economic system that made them dependent, the family structure that enabled their abuse. All of these were part of a coordinated campaign to break girls' spirits before they could develop the strength to resist. And it worked. For generations it worked so well that many Victorian women genuinely believed their suffering was natural, inevitable, and even noble. They taught their daughters to expect pain, to distrust pleasure, to submit without question, and to find meaning in sacrifice. But systems of oppression, no matter how complete or sophisticated, always contain the seeds of their own destruction. Because human beings, even those who have been systematically broken and trained to accept their breaking, retain some spark of dignity and autonomy that can never be completely extinguished. Some Victorian women, despite everything working against them, began to see through the lies they had been told about their own nature and worth. They began to ask dangerous questions, form underground networks, and imagine different ways of living. These women were the cracks in the foundation of Victorian sexual terrorism. They were the proof that no system of oppression, no matter how total it seems, can completely destroy the human capacity for resistance, growth, and change. The gaslight is flickering more steadily now, and the fog is beginning to thin. We can see the outlines of buildings, the shapes of people moving through the streets, the first faint suggestions that there might be a world beyond this nightmare of control and abuse. But before we step into that emerging light, we we need to witness the moment when Victorian sexual ideology finally began to crack, when enough women found their voices to create a chorus that couldn't be silenced or pathologized or locked away. We need to see how individual acts of resistance grew into collective movements, how whispered conversations became public demands, how the courage of women who had been taught they were worthless began to reshape the world. The dawn is coming, but it's a dawn that was earned through the blood, tears, and unbreakable will of women who refused to accept that their suffering was their destiny. And their story, the story of how Victorian sexual terrorism finally began to crumble, is the light at the end of this very dark tunnel we've been walking through together. The shadows are beginning to shift now, and through the gaslit gloom we can finally see the first stirrings of rebellion, because even in the darkest corners of Victorian sexual terrorism, there were women who refused to accept that their suffering was ordained by God, nature, or medical science. These weren't the famous suffragettes whose names you might recognise from history books. These were ordinary women who made extraordinary choices, often at extraordinary cost. Picture this. It's 1850, and you're a woman named Sarah who works as a seamstress in a textile factory. You've watched 3 of your friends die in childbirth before the age of 25. You've seen girls barely older than children disappear into the workhouse pregnant and emerge broken, if they emerge at all. You've listened to the factory doctor explain that women who work too hard damage their reproductive organs, while paying you wages so low that working yourself to exhaustion is the only way to afford a corner of a shared room. And one day, something snaps. Maybe it's watching another girl collapse from exhaustion. Maybe it's the moment you realise the same men who preach about women's delicate nature are the ones forcing you to work 16-hour days in dangerous conditions. Whatever it is, you start asking questions that Victorian society really doesn't want answered. Why do the women who supposedly need the most protection receive the least? Why do the doctors who claim to understand women's bodies know so little about keeping them healthy? Why do the laws designed to preserve female virtue seem to punish women for having any virtue to preserve? These questions were dangerous because they pointed to the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Victorian sexual ideology. If women were really as fragile, pure, and naturally domestic as society claimed, then why did maintaining that image require so much violence? The first cracks in Victorian sexual control appeared not in Parliament or universities, but in kitchens, factories, and tenement rooms, where women began sharing information that was supposed to be forbidden. They whispered about herbs that could prevent pregnancy. They taught each other to read, passing along books and pamphlets that opened up worlds beyond domestic servitude. They formed mutual aid societies that provided alternatives to the charity systems designed to shame them into submission. Margaret Llewellyn Davies, a working-class woman who became a leader in the Women's Cooperative Guild, described these early networks as universities of the washhouse. Women who had been told they were too stupid for education taught each other mathematics while doing laundry. They discussed politics while mending clothes. They shared medical knowledge while preparing meals for families that society insisted were their only proper concern. But knowledge alone wasn't enough to break the system. What these women needed was a way to challenge Victorian sexual ideology that couldn't be dismissed as hysteria, moral insanity, or feminine weakness. They needed to prove that women could think, reason, and organise as effectively as men. Enter the moral reform movements of the mid-19th century. Temperance societies, anti-slavery organisations, and charity work gave Victorian women their first taste of legitimate public activity. These movements were considered acceptable because they were framed as extensions of women's natural moral authority rather than challenges to male dominance. But something interesting happened when women started organising around moral issues. They discovered they were really good at it. They could run meetings, manage finances, coordinate complex campaigns, and speak persuasively in public. They could do all the things they had been told they were naturally incapable of doing. More importantly, moral reform work brought women face to face with the realities of Victorian sexual hypocrisy. Women campaigning against prostitution discovered that the men who publicly supported their cause were often the same men who privately patronised brothels. Women working with unwed mothers learned that the fathers of illegitimate children were rarely held accountable for their role in creating those children. Frances Willard, the American temperance leader, whose influence spread throughout the English-speaking world, began her career arguing that women needed the vote to protect the home and family. But as she learned more about the connections between alcohol, domestic violence, and women's economic dependence, her message evolved into something much more radical. By the 1880s, Willard was arguing that women's subordination in marriage was itself a form of slavery, that economic dependence made true consent impossible, and that women needed not just legal protection, but complete equality to achieve real security. She had started as a moral reformer and ended as a revolutionary, following a path that thousands of other Victorian women would walk. But the most direct challenge to Victorian sexual ideology came from women who had survived its worst abuses and lived to tell about it. Josephine Butler, whose campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts we discussed earlier, didn't start as a feminist. She started as a grieving mother whose 3-year-old daughter had died in a tragic accident. In her grief, Butler began working with prostitutes in Liverpool, expecting to find the degraded, morally corrupted women that Victorian ideology had taught her to expect. Instead, she found women who had been driven to sex work by poverty, violence, and the complete absence of alternatives. She found women who were intelligent, resourceful, and capable of deep love and loyalty, despite everything society had done to them. Butler's work with these women opened her eyes to the systematic nature of women's oppression. She realised that the difference between respectable women and fallen women wasn't moral character, but luck, circumstance, and social protection. Any woman could find herself cast out of respectable society through rape, seduction, economic desperation, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This recognition led Butler to challenge not just the Contagious Diseases Acts, but the entire framework of Victorian sexual morality. She argued that the real problem wasn't women's sexuality, but men's sexual violence and exploitation. She insisted that women had the right to control their own bodies and make their own moral choices. Butler's campaign against state-regulated prostitution was revolutionary, not just because it challenged specific laws, but because it challenged the fundamental assumption that women's bodies were public property to be managed by male authorities. When she argued that women should not be subjected to forced medical examinations, she was asserting that women had the right to bodily autonomy. The response to Butler's campaign revealed just how threatening this idea was to Victorian society. She was called a whore, a madwoman, and a destroyer of civilization. Her meetings were broken up by angry mobs. She received death threats and was physically attacked in the street. But she also received support from thousands of women who had been waiting for someone to speak the truths they'd been forbidden to voice. Butler's campaign became a school for feminist organising, teaching women how to petition Parliament, organise public meetings, raise funds, and coordinate national campaigns. More importantly, it gave women a language for talking about sexual oppression that couldn't be dismissed as feminine weakness or moral corruption. Butler framed her arguments in terms of justice, human rights, and Christian morality, using the very values that Victorian society claimed to hold dear to expose its hypocrisy. By the 1880s, a new generation of women was emerging who had been educated in these informal schools of resistance. They had learned that Victorian claims about women's natural incapacity were lies. They had discovered that women could organise, think, and act as effectively as men when given the opportunity. These women began to connect the dots between different forms of oppression. They saw that the medical establishment's control over women's bodies, the legal system's denial of women's rights, and the economic system's exclusion of women from independence were all part of the same structure of domination. Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first woman to qualify as a physician in Britain, spent her career documenting the ways that Victorian medicine harmed rather than helped women. She published papers showing that the rest cure made women sicker, that surgical removal of healthy organs was unnecessary and dangerous, and that many of the symptoms attributed to hysteria were actually the result of malnutrition, overwork, and domestic violence. Anderson's work was revolutionary because it came from within the medical establishment itself. She couldn't be dismissed as an ignorant woman who didn't understand science. She was a trained physician who was using scientific methods to challenge scientific orthodoxy. Similarly, women like Frances Power Cobbe began using legal scholarship to challenge the legal framework of women's subordination. Cobbe's essay, Wife Torture in England, documented the systematic nature of domestic violence and argued that the legal doctrine of coverture made women vulnerable to abuse by denying them any legal recourse. These intellectual challenges were backed up by practical organising. Women's rights activists began establishing alternative institutions that provided women with services the existing system denied them. They opened schools that gave girls serious academic educations. They created employment agencies that helped women find work that paid living wages. They established legal aid societies that helped women navigate divorce proceedings and child custody disputes. Most importantly, they began establishing women-only spaces where women could speak freely about their experiences without fear of male judgment or intervention. Women's clubs, suffrage societies, and reform organisations became laboratories for developing feminist consciousness and strategy. In these spaces, women began to articulate a new vision of female sexuality that challenged every assumption of Victorian ideology. They argued that women were sexual beings with natural desires and the right to pleasure. They insisted that women had the capacity for intellectual and moral reasoning equal to men's. They demanded the right to control their own bodies, choose their own partners, and determine their own destinies. This new feminist consciousness was spreading just as Victorian sexual ideology was beginning to show signs of internal collapse. The contradictions that had always existed within the system were becoming impossible to ignore. The declining birth rate among the middle and upper classes proved that women were finding ways to control their fertility despite all legal and social barriers. The increasing number of women entering higher education and professional work demonstrated that intellectual activity didn't actually damage women's reproductive capacity. The success of women's organising efforts showed that women were perfectly capable of rational thought and effective action. Even more damaging to Victorian ideology was the growing awareness of the extent of sexual violence within supposedly respectable families. As women began speaking more openly about their experiences, it became clear that domestic abuse, marital rape, and incest were not rare aberrations, but common features of Victorian family life. The ideal of the pure, protected Victorian woman was revealed to be a myth that served to hide rather than prevent women's victimization. The same social structures that supposedly protected women's virtue were actually enabling men to abuse women with impunity. By the 1890s, a critical mass of women had developed both the consciousness and the organisational capacity to mount a sustained challenge to Victorian sexual terrorism. They had learned to speak in public, organise campaigns, raise funds, and coordinate across class and national boundaries. Most importantly, they had learned to trust their own experiences and perceptions rather than accepting male authorities' interpretations of their lives. They had discovered that the problems they faced weren't individual failures, but systematic oppression, and that systematic oppression required systematic resistance. The new woman of the 1890s was the product of this decades-long process of feminist education and organising. She was economically independent, intellectually ambitious, and sexually autonomous. She wore rational dress that allowed for physical movement. She pursued higher education and professional careers. She delayed marriage or avoided it altogether. She claimed the right to sexual pleasure and reproductive choice. The new woman terrified Victorian society precisely because she represented everything that Victorian sexual ideology claimed was impossible. She was living proof that women didn't need male protection, that intellectual activity enhanced rather than damaged women's health, and that female independence was not only possible but beneficial to society as a whole. The backlash against the new woman was swift and vicious. Anti-feminist writers churned out novels, essays, and medical treatises warning that women's liberation would lead to the collapse of civilization. They predicted that educated women would refuse to marry and bear children, leading to racial suicide. They argued that women's political participation would corrupt democracy and destroy the family. But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Too many women had tasted freedom, knowledge, and autonomy to be forced back into Victorian cages. The organised women's movement had created alternative institutions, support networks, and intellectual frameworks that could sustain resistance, even under intense pressure. The Victorian war against women's sexuality was beginning to crumble, not because of any single victory, but because women had learned to see through the lies that had sustained it. They had discovered that their suffering wasn't natural, inevitable, or divinely ordained. They had realised that the system that oppressed them was human-made and therefore could be human-changed. The gaslight is burning brighter now, and the fog is lifting to reveal not just individual women walking alone through dangerous streets, but groups of women walking together, supporting each other, sharing knowledge and strength. The dawn is still hours away, but for the first time in this long, dark night, it seems possible that morning might actually come. The transformation wasn't complete. It would take decades more struggle to dismantle the legal, medical, and social structures of Victorian sexual oppression, but the foundation had been cracked, and once a foundation cracks, the entire structure becomes vulnerable. The women who had survived Victorian sexual terrorism were about to become the architects of a new world, one where women's sexuality might finally be understood as a source of power rather than a mark of weakness, where women's bodies might belong to women themselves rather than to fathers, husbands, and doctors. The revolution had begun, not with grand gestures or famous speeches, but with thousands of small acts of resistance by ordinary women who had simply refused to accept that their suffering was their destiny, and that revolution would change everything. The cobblestones beneath your feet feel different now as we round the final corner of our journey through Victorian sexual horror. The gaslight flickers with something that might be hope, and the fog is beginning to thin enough that you can see other figures moving through the streets, women walking with purpose, carrying books, speaking in voices that carry further than whispers. We've spent this long dark night exploring how an entire civilization convinced itself that terrorizing women was a moral duty. We've seen the medical torture disguised as treatment, the legal frameworks that turned women into property, the religious justifications that made suffering seem sacred. We've witnessed how Victorian society created a perfect storm of oppression that trapped women in their own bodies and convinced many of them that their cages were actually sanctuaries. But as devastating as this history is, there's something else we need to understand. The Victorian war against women's sexuality didn't end with the Victorian era. It evolved, adapted, and found new forms. Some of the ideas we've been examining tonight are still with us, still shaping how we think about women's bodies, women's desires, and women's autonomy. Think about it, the belief that women's sexuality is inherently dangerous and needs to be controlled. The assumption that women who enjoy sex too much are somehow unnatural or mentally unstable. The idea that women's primary value lies in their reproductive capacity. The notion that women's bodies are public property to be regulated by authorities who claim to know better than women themselves what's good for them. These aren't just historical curiosities gathering dust in academic journals. They're living ideas that continue to influence everything from medical practice to legal policy to social expectations. The Victorian legacy lives on in the way we talk about women's health, the way we regulate women's reproductive choices, the way we judge women's sexual behaviour. When we shame women for having multiple partners while celebrating men for the same behaviour, that's Victorian sexual ideology. When we treat women's pain as less serious or less real than men's pain, that's Victorian medicine. When we pass laws controlling women's reproductive choices while claiming it's for their own protection, that's Victorian paternalism. The tools have changed, but the underlying logic remains remarkably consistent. Women's bodies are still treated as problems to be solved, rather than as belonging to the women who inhabit them. Women's sexuality is still seen as something that needs to be managed, controlled, and channeled into socially acceptable forms. And just like their Victorian predecessors, modern systems of sexual control dress themselves up in the language of protection, health, and moral concern. They claim to be helping women while systematically undermining women's autonomy and agency. But here's what the Victorians never understood, and what their modern inheritors still struggle with. You cannot build a healthy society on the systematic oppression of half the population. You cannot create genuine morality through coercion and control. You cannot protect women by treating them as less than fully human. The women who began to resist Victorian sexual terrorism in the late 19th century understood something profound. Freedom isn't something that can be granted by benevolent authorities. It's something that has to be claimed, defended, and constantly renewed by the people who need it most. Those early feminists didn't just want to reform the worst abuses of Victorian society. They wanted to fundamentally reimagine what it meant to be human in a world where gender didn't determine destiny, where sexuality was a source of joy rather than terror, where women's bodies belonged to women themselves. And they understood that this kind of transformation couldn't happen through individual choice alone. It required collective action, institutional change, and a complete restructuring of the social, legal, and economic systems that made women's oppression possible. The battles they began are still being fought today. Every time a woman demands bodily autonomy, she's continuing the work of those Victorian rebels. Every time someone challenges the medical establishment's treatment of women's pain, they're following in the footsteps of Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson. Every time activists organise to protect reproductive rights, they're using strategies pioneered by Josephine Butler and Frances Willard. The gaslight has grown steady now, and the fog has lifted enough that you can see the horizon. Dawn is still hours away, but the darkness that seemed so absolute when we began this journey is beginning to show cracks where light can enter. As we prepare to step out of these Victorian streets and back into our own time, I want you to remember something important. The women whose stories we've shared tonight weren't heroes because they were perfect. They were heroes because they refused to accept that suffering was their natural state. They were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices under impossible circumstances. They were women who had been told they were weak, stupid, and naturally suited only for submission, who discovered they were actually strong, intelligent, and capable of reshaping the world. They were proof that no system of oppression, no matter how complete or sophisticated, can permanently destroy the human capacity for resistance, growth, and transformation. Their courage created the world we live in today, where women can vote, own property, pursue education and careers, control their fertility, and speak openly about sexuality without being locked in asylums. The freedoms we take for granted were bought with their blood, tears, and unbreakable determination. But their work isn't finished. The forces that created Victorian sexual terrorism are still active in the world, still finding new ways to convince people that someone else's control over their bodies is actually protection, that systematic oppression is natural law, that resistance is futile or dangerous. Understanding this history isn't just about honouring the past, it's about recognising these patterns when they emerge in new forms and having the knowledge and courage to resist them. The Victorian nightmare of sexual terrorism reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that freedoms can be lost as well as won, and that every generation has to choose whether to preserve and extend human dignity or to allow it to be eroded by fear, ignorance, and the desire for control. As you leave these gaslit streets behind and return to a world where women's bodies are still battlegrounds, but the battles are more evenly matched, remember that you carry the legacy of those Victorian rebels with you. Their courage lives in every choice you make to trust your own experience over authorities' explanations, to support other people's autonomy even when it makes you uncomfortable, to speak truth even when it's inconvenient or dangerous. The fog has lifted now, and the gaslight is beginning to fade into something that looks suspiciously like sunrise. The Victorian era of sexual terrorism is over, but the struggle for human dignity and autonomy continues. And in that struggle, you're not alone. You're part of a long line of people who have refused to accept that suffering is inevitable, that oppression is natural, or that some human beings are worth less than others. The women who survived Victorian sexual terrorism and fought to create something better didn't do it for themselves alone. They did it for you, for your daughters, for all the people who would come after them who deserve to live in a world where bodies belong to the people who inhabit them. Now it's your turn to carry that torch forward, to recognise the shadows of Victorian thinking when they creep back into modern discourse, and to remember that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would trade other people's autonomy for their own comfort and control. The dawn is breaking over London now, and with it comes the promise that human beings can learn, grow, and create better ways of living together. The Victorian nightmare is ending, but the dream of human dignity and freedom is just beginning. Sweet dreams, and may you wake in a world where no one has to choose between their humanity and their safety, where desire is a source of joy rather than terror, and where every body belongs to the person who lives inside it. The gaslight has finally gone out, but the sun is rising, and in that light, everything looks possible. The morning light is growing stronger now, casting new shadows across these familiar streets, but we're not quite ready to leave the Victorian era behind, because there's one final thread we need to pull, one last secret these gaslit alleys have been whispering all night long. We've seen how Victorian sexual terrorism worked, how it justified itself, and how it finally began to crumble. But now we need to understand something even more crucial, how the trauma it created echoed through generations, shaping not just individual lives, but entire cultures in ways we're still discovering today. Picture this. It's 1920, 50 years after our journey began. The Victorian era is officially over. Women have the vote in many countries. The new woman has become simply women. Hemlines are rising, corsets are loosening, and jazz music is playing in dance halls where men and women move together with a freedom that would have scandalised their grandmothers. But in a quiet bedroom in a respectable suburban home, a young bride named Margaret lies frozen on her wedding night, her body rigid with a terror she can't name or explain. Her mother prepared her for this moment with the same vague warnings about wifely duty that Victorian mothers had whispered for generations. Her grandmother's ghost seems to hover in the room, carrying messages about female virtue and necessary suffering that feel ancient and unshakable. Margaret represents something that Victorian reformers hadn't fully anticipated. Trauma doesn't die with the systems that create it. It gets passed down through generations like a poisonous, inheritance, carried in the way mothers hold their daughters, in the words they use to describe women's bodies, in the silences that surround her female experience. The women who survived Victorian sexual terrorism often became unwitting carriers of its legacy. They had learned to distrust their own desires so completely that they couldn't teach their daughters to trust theirs. They had internalized messages about female weakness and danger so deeply that they unconsciously transmitted those messages, even as they consciously rejected Victorian ideology. Dr. Marie Stopes, the pioneering birth control advocate whose work in the early 20th century helped women gain control over their reproductive lives, spent her career treating women who had been sexually and psychologically damaged by Victorian attitudes. In her clinical notes, she described patient after patient who suffered from what she called marriage phobia, a terror of sexual intimacy so profound that it made normal relationships impossible. These women weren't suffering from individual psychological problems. They were carrying the collective trauma of a culture that had spent generations teaching women to fear their own bodies. Stopes realized that changing laws and improving access to contraception wasn't enough. The psychological damage of Victorian sexual terrorism would take generations to heal. But healing was possible, and it was happening in ways both dramatic and subtle. The flappers of the 1920s weren't just rebelling against dress codes and social conventions. They were performing a kind of collective therapy, using their bodies to reclaim the physical freedom that had been stolen from their mothers and grandmothers. When a young woman bobbed her hair, she was cutting away more than just Victorian fashion. She was severing the connection to generations of women who had been taught that their hair was their glory and their burden, something to be hidden, controlled, and managed by others. When she danced the Charleston, she was moving her body in ways that proclaimed ownership, joy, and autonomous choice. The sexual revolution that historians usually date to the 1960s actually began in the 1920s, as the first generation of women born after Victorian sexual terrorism reached adulthood. These women had grown up hearing stories about the bad old days when women couldn't vote, own property, or speak in public. They took their freedoms for granted in ways their mothers never could, but they also inherited wounds they didn't understand. The mother who flinched when her daughter laughed too loudly. The grandmother who insisted that nice girls didn't enjoy physical activity. The family doctor who still believed that too much education would damage a woman's reproductive capacity. The religious leader who preached that female desire was inherently corrupting. These mixed messages created a generation of women caught between old fears and new possibilities. They wanted the freedom their feminist predecessors had fought for, but they carried psychological scars from battles they had never personally fought. The medical establishment was slow to recognize this generational trauma, partly because many doctors were still operating from Victorian assumptions about female psychology. When women complained of sexual dysfunction, anxiety about their bodies, or difficulty enjoying physical intimacy, they were often told these were individual problems requiring individual solutions. But some pioneering researchers began to see patterns. Dr. Catherine Bement Davis conducted one of the first large-scale studies of women's sexuality in the 1920s, surveying over 2,000 women about their sexual experiences and attitudes. What she found was a generation in transition, caught between Victorian shame and modern possibility. Many of the women in Davis's study reported that they had received no useful information about sexuality before marriage. They described wedding nights characterized by fear, pain, and confusion. They talked about years of marriage during which they never experienced physical pleasure or emotional satisfaction. But they also described a growing awareness that things could be different, that their mothers' experiences didn't have to be their own. The women who participated in Davis's study were pioneers in their own right. They were among the first to speak openly about female sexuality, to admit that they wanted and deserved pleasure. to reject the Victorian idea that women were naturally passionless. They were beginning the long work of healing generational trauma through honest conversation and shared experience. This healing process wasn't linear or simple. The economic upheaval of the Great Depression pushed many families back toward traditional gender roles, as survival became the primary concern. The Second World War created new opportunities for women's independence, but also new forms of trauma and disruption. Each crisis revealed how fragile the progress away from Victorian sexual terrorism really was. When economic or social pressures increased, societies often retreated toward familiar patterns of controlling women's bodies and sexuality. The Victorian ghost wasn't easily exorcised. The 1950s saw a particularly dramatic resurgence of Victorian ideals repackaged for the modern age. The suburban housewife became the new angel in the house, pure and domestic and devoted to others' needs above her own. Television shows, magazines, and advice books promoted an idealized vision of femininity that would have been recognizable to Victorian moralists. But there was something different about 1950s domesticity. It was performed rather than simply accepted. The women who embraced suburban motherhood as their highest calling often did so with a self-consciousness that their Victorian predecessors had lacked. They were choosing roles that earlier generations had simply inherited. This element of choice, even when the options were limited, represented a fundamental shift from Victorian sexual terrorism. Women might still be constrained by social expectations and economic realities, but they weren't legally or medically prevented from making different choices. The cage doors were unlocked, even if many women chose to remain inside. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, gave a name to the dissatisfaction many 1950s women felt, despite having achieved the domestic ideal that society told them should make them happy. Friedan described the problem that has no name, the sense of emptiness and unfulfillment that plagued women who had everything they were supposed to want. But Friedan's analysis went deeper than individual psychology. She traced the problem back to the systematic denial of women's full humanity, the reduction of female identity to biological function, the insistence that women could only find meaning through serving others. She was describing the lingering effects of Victorian sexual terrorism in modern form. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s represented another phase in the long process of healing from Victorian trauma. The consciousness-raising groups where women shared their experiences, the speak-outs about rape and domestic violence, the demands for reproductive freedom, all of these were forms of collective therapy for injuries that had been inflicted generations earlier. When women burned their bras in public demonstrations, they weren't just protesting uncomfortable undergarments. They were rejecting the entire Victorian apparatus of physical constraint and control. When they demanded the right to abortion, they weren't just seeking medical procedures. They were claiming the bodily autonomy that their great-grandmothers had been denied. The personal became political, because the political had always been personal. Victorian sexual terrorism had made women's most intimate experiences into matters of public concern and state control. The feminist movement of the late 20th century was reclaiming that intimate territory as rightfully belonging to women themselves. But even as legal and social barriers fell, the psychological legacy of Victorian sexual terrorism proved remarkably persistent. Therapists began treating increasing numbers of women for what would eventually be recognised as intergenerational trauma, patterns of fear, shame, and self-denial that had been passed down through families for generations. Dr. Judith Herman's groundbreaking work on trauma and recovery helped explain how the systematic abuse of women under Victorian ideology had created psychological wounds that could persist long after the original abuse ended. Women who had never personally experienced Victorian medical torture still carried its effects in their relationships, with their own bodies. The shame about menstruation, the fear of sexual pleasure, the tendency to prioritize others' needs over their own, the difficulty trusting their own perceptions and desires. These patterns could be traced back through generations to mothers and grandmothers who had been broken by Victorian sexual terrorism and had unconsciously transmitted their brokenness to their daughters. But Herman's work also revealed something hopeful. Trauma could be healed through connection, truth-telling, and the reclaiming of agency. The same processes that had allowed Victorian women to begin resisting their oppression, sharing experiences, forming supportive relationships, speaking truth to power, could help their descendants heal from the wounds they had inherited. The internet age brought new possibilities for this healing process. Women could connect across geographical and cultural boundaries to share experiences and support each other's recovery. Online communities formed around every aspect of female experience that had been shrouded in Victorian shame. Menstruation, sexuality, childbirth, menopause, aging. These digital spaces became laboratories for developing new languages around female experience, languages free from Victorian euphemisms and medical pathologizing. Women began reclaiming words that had been used to shame them, transforming slut and bitch and witch from insults into badges of pride. The Not Me Too movement represented perhaps the most dramatic example of collective healing from sexual trauma in human history. When women began sharing their experiences of sexual assault and harassment, they were doing more than seeking individual justice. They were breaking the silence that had protected abusers for generations and revealing the systemic nature of sexual violence. Many of the patterns revealed by Me Too would have been familiar to Victorian feminists. The use of women's economic dependence to coerce sexual compliance, the medical and legal systems that protected men while blaming women, the social mechanisms that silenced victims while protecting perpetrators. But the response was different. Instead of being isolated and pathologized, women who spoke out found themselves part of a global chorus of voices. Instead of being dismissed as hysterical or attention-seeking, they were believed and supported. Instead of being told their experiences were individual problems, they were recognized as symptoms of systemic oppression. This shift from individual pathology to systemic analysis represented a fundamental break from Victorian thinking about women's suffering. The idea that women's pain might be evidence of injustice rather than inherent weakness, that women's anger might be rational rather than hysterical, that women's demands for change might be legitimate rather than selfish. These concepts would have been revolutionary in Victorian times. Today, we're living through what might be called the final phase of recovery from Victorian sexual terrorism. The legal frameworks that once denied women basic rights have been dismantled in most developed countries. The medical establishment has largely abandoned the practice of pathologizing normal female experiences. The religious and cultural institutions that once preached female subordination have been forced to evolve or lose relevance. But the psychological legacy remains. We see it in the way young women still struggle with body image and sexual shame. We see it in the persistence of sexual violence and the victim blaming that often follows. We see it in the ongoing debates about reproductive rights, where women's autonomy is still treated as a matter for public rather than private decision-making. The ghost of Victorian sexual terrorism haunts us in subtler ways too, in the way medical research still often ignores or minimises women's experiences, in the way workplace cultures still punish women for being too aggressive or too emotional, in the way popular culture still promotes impossible standards of female perfection while celebrating male imperfection as charming. But understanding this history gives us power over it. When we recognise Victorian patterns in modern discourse, we can name them, challenge them, and refuse to be controlled by them. When we see women being shamed for their sexuality, pathologised for their anger, or dismissed for their ambitions, we can remember that these responses aren't natural or inevitable. They're the lingering effects of a system of oppression that we have the power to continue dismantling. The women who first resisted Victorian sexual terrorism couldn't have imagined the world we live in today, where their great-great-granddaughters can speak openly about sexuality, pursue any career, control their fertility, and expect to be treated as full human beings. But they dreamed of that world, fought for it, and passed their dreams down through generations of women who refused to accept that suffering was their destiny. We are the fulfillment of their wildest dreams, and the beginning of dreams they couldn't yet imagine. Every time we trust our own perceptions over authorities' explanations, every time we support another woman's autonomy, even when it makes us uncomfortable, every time we speak truth about our experiences instead of hiding behind euphemisms and shame, we're continuing their work. The gaslight has been extinguished now, replaced by electric lights that shine steadily without flickering. The fog has lifted completely, revealing a world where women walk safely through streets they help to govern, where their bodies belong to themselves, where their voices carry weight in public discourse. But the work isn't finished. It never will be, because freedom isn't a destination, but a practice, something that has to be chosen and protected and renewed by every generation. The Victorian nightmare of sexual terrorism reminds us that progress isn't inevitable, that vigilance is the price of liberty, and that the courage to resist oppression in any form is one of the most important gifts we can pass on to the future. As we step out of these historical streets and back into our own time, we carry with us the wisdom of women who survived the worst humanity could devise and still found ways to love, to hope, and to fight for something better. Their legacy lives in every choice we make to treat ourselves and others as fully human, worthy of dignity, respect, and the right to determine our own destinies. The sun is fully risen now, and in its light everything looks not just possible, but inevitable. The long night of Victorian sexual terrorism is over, but the dawn of human dignity and freedom is just beginning. And in that dawn, we are all the inheritors of a revolution that started with a few brave women who simply refused to accept that their suffering was their fate. Sweet dreams of the future. And may you wake in a world where the shadows of the past no longer have the power to darken the present, where every body belongs to the person who lives inside it, and where the only authority over your sexuality is your own freely given consent. The Victorian nightmare is ending, but the dream of freedom is eternal. The sun is fully risen now, and as we take our final steps through these transformed streets, I want you to carry something with you. Not just the horror of what we've witnessed, but the profound recognition of human resilience. Because here's what the Victorians never understood, what every system of oppression fails to grasp. You can break people's bodies, you can silence their voices, you can even convince them that their suffering is deserved, but you cannot permanently destroy the human capacity for resistance, growth, and transformation. The women whose stories we've shared tonight weren't heroes because they were perfect. They were heroes because they were human. They felt fear, doubt, and despair just like anyone else. But somewhere in the depths of their terror, they found something unbreakable, a spark of dignity that refused to be extinguished, a whisper of truth that grew into a roar. And that spark exists in you too. It exists in every person who's ever been told they're worth less than they are, that their body isn't their own, that their desires are dangerous or wrong. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago, but its echoes still reverberate through our world in ways both obvious and subtle. When we shame people for their sexuality while celebrating others for the exact same behaviour, that's Victorian thinking. When we treat certain bodies as public property to be regulated and controlled, that's Victorian logic. When we pathologise natural human responses to trauma and oppression, we're using Victorian medical reasoning. But now, you have the tools to recognize these patterns, to name them, and to resist them. You've seen how sophisticated systems of oppression work, how they justify themselves, and most importantly, how they can be dismantled by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. The fog has completely lifted now, and the gaslight has given way to electric street lamps that burn steady and bright. But more than that, you can see other people walking these streets, people of all genders carrying themselves with a dignity and autonomy that would have been unthinkable in Victorian times. These modern streets aren't perfect. We still have work to do, battles to fight, progress to make, but they're streets where consent matters, where bodies belong to the people who inhabit them, where speaking truth about your experience is seen as courage rather than madness. The women who survived Victorian sexual terrorism and fought to create something better didn't do it for themselves alone. They did it for you, for your children, for all the people who would come after them, who deserved to live in a world where humanity wasn't rationed based on gender, class, or conformity to impossible standards. Now it's your turn to carry that torch forward, to remember that progress isn't inevitable, that freedom requires constant vigilance, and that the price of dignity is the willingness to defend it, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. The Victorian nightmare of sexual terrorism is over, but the dream of human liberation is eternal. It lives in every choice you make to trust your own experience over authorities' explanations, to support others' autonomy even when it challenges your comfort, to speak truth even when silence would be easier. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that you are the answer to the prayers of women who died centuries before you were born. You are living proof that their suffering wasn't meaningless, that their resistance mattered, that their dreams of a better world were not in vain. The gaslight has been extinguished forever, replaced by a light that burns steady and true. In that light, everything looks not just possible, but inevitable. The long, dark night is over, and the dawn belongs to you. Sweet dreams, and may you wake in a world where the shadows of the past no longer have the power to darken the present, where every voice matters, every story counts, and every human being is recognized as worthy of dignity, respect, and the fundamental right to determine their own destiny. The Victorian era of sexual terrorism has ended, but the age of human freedom has just begun.